tonight, we're very honored to have Miss Maria van Lieshout, a writer, illustrator, and the author of Song of the Blackbird. Maria will share the story of discovering documents written by her grandparents decades earlier about living in Holland under Nazi occupation. Copies of her book are available for sale right back there. If you're not prepared to purchase this evening, but you'd like to, you can also get copies of the book at the In Bloom bookstore in Old Town. That's on Main Street, right behind the bank, if you know where that is, toward the creek. It's on the right, the Clock Tower building, I think it's called there. And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you so much
for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Dave. Very nice. And I am very, very pleased to be here. I love this turnout. This is a really nice surprise for me. And Rebecca gave us a tour of the area and told us a little bit about its history, and I am in awe. You are so lucky to live here and to have this be your home and to have this be a place to meet. I think it's tremendous, and I think it's as somebody who appreciates history, I think it's wonderful. So yes, my name is Maria van Lieshout, as Dave already mentioned. So I'm an author and an illustrator of books for young children and now also for teens and adults, because this book is officially a young adult, but I've learned that adults of all ages respond to it too. I grew up in the Netherlands in a town very close to Amsterdam. My entire family is from Amsterdam. My mom and my grandparents and my great-grandparents were all born and raised in Amsterdam, so we have very close ties with the city. I didn't move to the US until 1997, so roughly the first 20-something years of my life I spent in the Netherlands, so I'm very Dutch. And what I wanted to do today is to talk a little bit about the story behind the story. So instead of reading from the book, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey and tell you how this book came about. So when I grew up, this little painting was always hanging on our wall. And as a child, I never paid much attention to it until one day my mom told me its story. And she said that the painting had not always been small and oval, but once upon a time it was a large painting featuring her entire upper body with a little bunny. And the painting had been painted at the very beginning of the Second World War when she was just, I think she was like a 2-year-old girl. And it was hanging in her childhood home in Amsterdam. And behind her house, before the war, was a school. But as soon as the Nazis invaded Amsterdam, they requisitioned that school and turned it into SS headquarters. So the school right behind her house became literally the center of the Nazi occupation in the Netherlands. And as you know, the SS was the military police branch of the Nazi party, and overnight the sound in her backyard changed from laughing and screaming children to literally screaming people, because the SS would hold prisoners, would hold resistance fighters in the cellars where the bikes used to be parked, and torture them in order to get information. So overnight that building changed to a very grim place. In 1944, the RAF, the British Royal Air Force, decided to bomb SS headquarters. So on a Sunday afternoon at 1:30 p.m., a whole number of Hawker Typhoons flew over Amsterdam and bombed the entire neighborhood. And of course, the SS headquarters was destroyed, but so were more than 50 homes in my mother's neighborhood, including my mom's home. More than 50 people died. So it was a very traumatic event in my mother's memory, one that she distinctly remembers, even though she was very, very young. By the time that happened, she was 4.5 years old. And the house was destroyed and the painting was destroyed. But just a few days after the bombing, my grandfather walked into a local park and he found the painting blown to bits, but her little face was actually saved. So he was able to cut the face out and turn it into a small oval painting, the one that was hanging in my home when I was just a young child. And for me, it's very symbolic because my mom's face was actually rescued twice that day, because every single day at 1:30, my mom would be taking a nap. But that one day, she was allowed to skip her nap and have lunch with the family. And because of that, she was not in her little bed, because the bomb went right through her bed and a wall toppled on top of the bed.
And
so
have lunch with the family.
had she
And because of that, she was not.
Oh, had she, I think that's an echo. Like, that's my voice. Had she been napping, as she always was, there is no way that she would have survived it. So it's a very symbolic painting that I'm very fond of, because it absolutely symbolizes how she was rescued that day. That wasn't the only story that my mom told us. She also told us the story of the Blackbird. A few months after the bombing, it was what was called the Hunger Winter in Amsterdam. It was the last winter of the Second World War, and everything was very cold and everything was very grim because there was no food. The only way people would be able to buy food is to use ration coupons. And even if you had ration coupons, there simply wasn't any food available in stores. So my mom recalls there were days when all they ate was tulip bulbs because there simply wasn't anything else. Electricity was rationed. Nobody had anything to light fires with. So it was a very grim time in Amsterdam. Let me bend this a little bit. Yeah, that's better. One afternoon, my mom heard a Blackbird song. So she asked her mother, my grandmother, does the Blackbird realize it is wartime? To which my grandmother answered after some thought, yes, I believe the Blackbird realizes it's wartime and it sings so beautifully because of it, not despite it. So those were the two stories that my mom would tell us. But these are my grandparents. And when I was just a young girl, I would always ask them, so tell us stories about the Second World War. What did you experience? What did you think? What did you feel? And they always told us, no, we do not want to talk about it. This is too difficult. That was a very traumatic time in our life, and we do not want to revisit that. So we are only going to be talking about happy things. So when my grandmother passed away in 2016, I believed that all those stories had disappeared along with her death. I thought the stories are gone forever, until, while cleaning up her apartment, we found 2 documents and a book, a biography. And the first document was a document that was 19 pages long, that was written by both my grandmother and my grandfather. It included diagrams and maps, and it was a very detailed account of what had happened that day that their house was bombed. It talked about what it felt like, what it smelled like, how afraid they were, like huddled underneath the table, praying desperately that they might survive this. Some parts were written by my grandfather, some parts were written by my grandmother. Of course, it was written in Dutch. But the very last line was very meaningful to me. It was actually written in English. And the line reads, "Nothing dies when you remember." And I believe that is the clue, that is the reason why my grandparents decided to write it down. Even though talking about it and revisiting that time was extremely traumatic, they knew how important it was to document it so that one day I could read it. The second document was typed by my grandfather also in the 1980s, and it detailed everything he experienced with his best friend Frits. Frits and my grandfather were part of the resistance, and Frits was very heavy involved in the resistance, to the point that he could not live at home anymore because the SS was on his tail. The SS was always watching him, was trying to capture him. This building was their office. It's where the 2 men worked together, but Frits could also not show up to work anymore because it was simply not safe for him to do so. Well, one day, Frits came to my grandfather and said, "The SS is on my tail right now. You need to help me." So my grandfather said, "Well, let's exchange clothes and hats so we can throw them off your tail." So they exchanged hats, they exchanged clothes, And it worked. My grandfather was arrested and taken in for questioning to the SS headquarters. Fortunately, he was able to prove to them that he was not Frits and they let him go. But in doing so, he saved Fritz's life because Frits got away. That one time, because the document also describes a day in January 1945, just a few months before the end of the war, when Frits and my grandfather were at their office and they had a meeting and they talked and they said their goodbyes, they gave each other a hug, and Frits walked right around the corner to another resistance meeting, and it turned out the SS was already waiting for him. So he walked straight into a trap. And not just he, along with him were a man by the name of Wally and a young woman by the name of Hanneke. Wally and Frits were interrogated at headquarters, and after about 2 weeks, they were publicly executed on a busy street corner, while neighbors, including young children, were forced to watch. Hanneke was only 19 years old. She was just a teenager, and she became a political prisoner. She was held captive in the Nazi prison until the Netherlands was liberated. So, let me back up a little bit. So of course I was curious, like, what were their stories? Why were they arrested? What did they do exactly? And the book that we found was a biography of this man, Wally, and it explained exactly why the men and Hanneke had been arrested. What had happened is that the resistance needed cash, lots of cash, because I've already talked to some of you about the story of Anne Frank. But there were many Anne Franks living all over the Netherlands. There were literally tens of thousands of families and people living in hiding, in attics, under floorboards. And of course, there were no ration coupons allotted for these people living in hiding. So the way for them to eat was to buy food on the black market, and prices were exorbitant. So to buy something on the black market, you would pay, $25 for just a small slice of butter. So it was very expensive to try to source food for the people who were living in hiding. The resistance also created fake identity papers for Jewish people and people living in hiding. The resistance created false ration coupons. And of course, there was the armed resistance that needed money too. So the resistance needed a lot of money, and there basically wasn't any. So Wally had come up with an idea, and Wally became known as the resistance banker because of it. He knew that if he could forge these treasury bills, and the value of these treasury bills was 100,000 guilders. So that was roughly $40,000. So even by today's standards, that's a lot of money. But back then, that was even more money. Wally had figured out, if I can forge 500 of these, then and if we can cash those, then we will have so much money that the resistance will have plenty of cash to last us no matter how long the war lasts. So he pulled it off, but easier said than done, right? How do you forge these? Well, he found a stamp maker prepared to make the stamps that were applied to the treasury bills. He found a hand letterer who could replicate the Gothic typeface that was on the treasury bills. He found a handwriting forger who was able to forge the signature. And he found an illustrator who could draw the lions that are in the background. It's a little bit harder to see here, as well as the red border and some of the black printings here too. So he was able to find everyone to do the pre-press work, but then he had to find printers, right? Who could print the work. Well, he was able to do that too. He found a plate maker prepared to make 7 plates. So back then, things were printed using these copper plates. And you see 3 colors on the treasury bills: black for the text, red for the border, and gray for the background. But the treasury bills were actually printed on this very fancy paper that had little threads in 4 colors running through it. And that couldn't be sourced during the war, so they had to print the paper. So they found a second printer prepared to print that beautiful paper. And once that was finished, the paper was transported to a third printer who printed the last 3 print runs, the red border, the gray background, and the black text. And then when all those 500 were printed, somebody did the finishing work by adding the stamps and adding the signatures and adding the number. This was an enormous undertaking. And not only was it genius because they had to do this with very limited supplies because supplies just weren't able to be found during the war. Often during nighttime when print shops were closed and nobody was watching, and they had to do that using candlelight or oil lamps because electricity was rationed. So this was genius, and it was also heroic because every single one of them knew that if they would be caught, they would be arrested and most likely would be killed. So this was a very dangerous undertaking. But they pulled it off. They printed 500 of these treasury bills. They looked really fantastic, but they also knew, you know what, they are probably not going to stand up to scrutiny if we just go to banks and we exchange them at a bank. So they came up with a plan to exchange these 500 forgeries at the Dutch National Bank, where Wally knew somebody on the inside that was with the resistance, where the fake ones were swapped with authentic ones. Fortunately, electricity in the cellars of the Dutch National Bank was also rationed, so they did not have good lighting there. They only had candlelight, and that is what helped them swap the real ones for the forgeries. And then when they had the real ones, they could go to regular banks and trade it in, because now, of course, those authentic treasury bills would absolutely hold up against, magnifying glasses and scrutiny. So the resistance had all of a sudden was flush with cash. But how to distribute that cash? Because all cars were requisitioned, all trains were either not running or were used by the Nazis to deport people. So the way to distribute these throughout the Netherlands was by bicycle. And that was done by young women, and Hanneke was one of those young women who would have a pregnancy corset under her skirts and would basically travel around the Netherlands by bike with a big pregnant belly that contained lots of money. And again, this was not only very heroic and brave to be, cycling through wind and through rain just to the other side of Holland with this big belly, but it was also very courageous because, again, if they were caught, and some of them were caught, but Hanneke wasn't caught until she was, they would be penalized for that. So when I learned about these stories, when I read all these stories in that biography, and I learned about these people, I became so incredibly inspired, and I wanted to learn more about what had happened in Amsterdam during the Second World War. Were there other locations? Were there other places that were meaningful? And I narrowed it down to 5 places that had been extremely meaningful. Of course, in reality, there were 100, but these were the 5 that I focused on for my book. And the first one is called the Dutch Theater. And before the war, the Dutch Theater was a theater. It was in the middle of the Jewish quarter, and people would go there to have community with neighbors, to laugh, to dance, to have a good time. Well, as soon as the Nazis invaded Amsterdam, they requisitioned this theater and they turned it into a deportation center. So 46,000 Jewish people were held here and deported and murdered. So that is an insane amount. And how the Nazis did it is, as soon as they rounded up families or forced them to deport for deportation, they would separate the parents from the children. Across the street from the theater was a school, a teacher's college, and right next to the school, sort of on the right end of this photograph, was a childcare center, a Jewish childcare center, where Jewish women looked after children. And the Nazis also requisitioned that childcare center, And as soon as a family reported for deportation, the young children would be taken across the street to be cared for by these childcare workers until the moment that their parents would be deported. And right before deportation, their plan was the kids would be united and they would be sent to the trains to be taken to concentration camps. And families remained in the Dutch theater anywhere between, 2 days and 3 weeks. So some people were there for quite a significant amount of time. Well, these women that worked in a childcare center, they were incredibly brave. And they thought, we are going to try to rescue as many children as possible. So what they did is they came up with a plan to smuggle children out of the childcare center and to place them with non-Jewish families where they could be raised as their own. But of course, they could not do this without, the approval from the parents. So what they did is as soon as a child came to their childcare center, they would find the parents across the street at the Dutch theater, and they would look them up and they would ask them a question. They said, we have an opportunity to smuggle your child or your children out and place them with a family where they can be cared for until hopefully you return one day. Do you want to take this option or do you want to be deported along with your children? Well, you can only imagine what an impossible choice that is, right? To be, as a parent, to have to choose between taking your child with you to a future that you know is going to be horrendous, or you give your child to a family that you've never met to be cared for in hopes that you will see them again. Well, the parents of 600 children agreed to this plan. So these women, in the end, rescued 600 children. And how they went about doing this is as soon as the parents had given their approval, they would ask Walter Suskind, who was the Jewish man in charge of the Dutch theater of operations. He was put in charge by the Nazis. He would erase the name of the child from the files so that the Nazis would not know that the children were missing. And then the children would be taken to the backyard behind these buildings, where through the hedge, they were handed to this man. And this man was the headmaster of the teachers' college. And he would keep the children in the attic until it was safe for the children to be smuggled out. And then his female students would take the children and take them to whichever family had agreed to take them in. They chose women to do that because a woman with a young child was not suspicious. A young man with a child would be much more suspicious. So that's why they selected young women to do this. Again, this was incredibly heroic, and 600 children were indeed saved. I actually interviewed one of those children and became good friends with him. In fact, he's my parents' age, and his story is absolutely unbelievable. But there were more locations. I also came across a church, and this is Father Theo, and Father Theo was in charge of the church, and he hid Jewish families in the church and in the convent next door. He sheltered them. He gave them food and supplies and made sure that many of them survived the war. So he's also responsible for quite a few people surviving the war. And then the last building I'd like to discuss is this building. It was a publishing house. It was the very first publishing house in the Netherlands, founded and run entirely by women, the two women at the top, these two women. When the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, they installed something called the Nazi Culture Chamber. And what the Nazi Culture Chamber was an organization where every single artist, journalist, musician, anybody who was involved with the arts or with creative expression had to register with the Culture Chamber. And the Culture Chamber had very strict rules for art. So for instance, a painter, if you were a member of the Culture Chamber, could only paint Germanic scenes featuring white people. If you were a musician, you were not allowed to play jazz or scat music or swing music or anything that was not Germanic. And the same rules applied across the board to anybody who published or created works of art. If you refused to join the culture chamber, which was an option, you basically committed professional suicide, because from that moment on, you were prohibited from publishing, from performing, from exhibiting. I believe that as a storyteller and as an author and an illustrator, I believe that the Nazis did this because they understood the power of art and the power of stories. Because when we experience a piece of music by a musician who perhaps has a lived experience different from ours, or when we read a book about a person who's different from us, then we see the world through their eyes for a little bit. And the Nazis understood this, and this is exactly why they wanted such control over all sorts of artistic expression. Well, these two women, the founders of the publishing house, they refused to join. And as a consequence, the Nazis shut them down. So they were, from that moment on, prohibited from publishing any more books. So what did they do? They joined the resistance, and they turned their publishing house into a hub of resistance. And they invited all their artist friends to come over and to use their art and their creativity to apply it to the resistance. So they were the ones in charge of forging identity papers, of making fake ration coupons, of helping forge the treasury bills that we just talked about. So they became enormously influential in the Netherlands, and they kept a lot of people alive. But because of those, their organization forged 70,000 identity papers. So you can only imagine how many people were able to stay out of Nazi hands because they did not have that J in their identity paper, or because they were able to carry on under a different name and continue their resistance work. So these were the 5 houses that I boiled my research down to. And I felt strongly about wanting to include these 5 houses in my story. So I built my entire book around these 5 houses. My book has 5 chapters, and every single chapter deals with a different building and tells the story behind the building. My book is fictional, but it is very, very closely inspired by the actual stories. These are all the people that I've talked about. These are all the brave people who joined the resistance and put the well-being of other people ahead of their own when it was really very dangerous to do so. And that came at a price. Every picture that's grayed out was somebody who ended up being arrested or rounded up or caught by the Nazis. And everyone who's blacked out was murdered by the Nazis. So only 3 people stayed, of these people I talked about, stayed out of Nazi hands altogether. And only 6 people survived it. So that is a very, very grim statistics. And because I was so inspired by these people, I thought about what my grandfather had written, "Nothing dies when you remember." And that is the reason that my characters in my book are so heavily inspired by these historical figures. So every main character is inspired by one of these people that I spoke about. I am often asked the question, why a fictional story? Why not tell the true story? Well, there was one thing I learned. It took me 12 years to write this book, and many of those years was spent just doing research, just reaching out to people, talking to the descendants of the people I studied, spending afternoons in the Amsterdam City Archives or in the War Archives. I became aware of the fact that heroic facts or heroic deeds are rarely pulled off by just a few. The bank heist that I talked about, even though in my book I only, show a handful of characters, it was literally hundreds, if not thousands of people who worked together towards that common goal. The same situation with the 600 children who were rescued from the child care center. There were countless women and children and teachers and people who helped behind the scenes, families who agreed to take these children in, even though that was also a risk to them. So that is something I've learned, that when people bond together and they work in community towards a goal, there is a lot that we can achieve. But oftentimes it involves a lot of people. For me, it was important to make the story, keep the story quite accessible, especially for a younger audience, especially for a teenage audience. And that is the reason I chose for a fictional story, because that enabled me to combine characters, to simplify storylines, and to take some liberties with the story, even though I do have to say it was my goal to stay as close to the original story as I could. And in fact, the back of the story is the actual story. So the front of the story is the fictional story. It's sort of the graphic novel part, and there is a quite substantial back matter that explains exactly what the actual stories were and who the people were that inspired my storyline. The book also has two storylines. One is set in 2011 and one is set in 1943. In the 1943 storyline, we follow a young female artist who rescues these two children from the child care center and then gets pulled into the resistance further and further. So as she goes on to forge identity papers and then actually is involved with the bank heist and starts, forging the treasury bills. And in the storyline in 2011, we follow a young woman who learns that her grandmother is gravely ill and has leukemia. And in trying to find a donor to help her recover from this, it becomes evident that grandmother is not related to her siblings. So, and this is news to grandmother, and this is news to the main character. And my main character goes on a bit of a scavenger hunt to find out what really happened to her grandmother, and if there is still a living relative out there who could possibly be a bone marrow donor. And she uses the 5 prints who are hanging on, which are hanging on her grandmother's wall as guidance. So along those 5 prints, she uncovers the history of what happened in Amsterdam, and she uncovers what really happened to her grandmother. I will say one more thing, actually. I'm often asked too why it was important for me to include 2 storylines. And the answer to that is that I grew up with 2 parents who were both children during the Second World War, and I have seen up close what an enormous impact war has on people. And if you experience war as a little child, as a young boy or girl, this will stay with you the rest of your life. You know, my mom vividly remembers the bombing. It's very traumatic for her. She actually saw her neighbor blown up. And this is an image that she's never been able to get out of her mind. She remembers the famine they lived under. My father basically grew up as an orphan during the war. So my parents were both quite traumatized as young children, and I have seen the role that has played throughout their lives, and I see how that is often passed on to subsequent generations. And I wanted to show that in the book, and I decided to do this by including 2 storylines, because the 2 children that we meet at the very beginning of the 2011 storyline, we meet them again at the very end of the book, and now they've become older people, and we see the effect that the war has had on their life and how that has shaped them to a large extent. Now, the book has a narrator, and the narrator is inspiration itself, because ultimately this book is about the very brave artists who were part of the resistance. I write the book from the perspective of Emma, a young artist in the Amsterdam Resistance, and show how critical she was in forging those documents and how many lives she saved. And so it was important for me to show that the power of art is to fight hate, that art has tremendous power to fight division. Stories can do this art can do this, music can do this. And those resistance fighters very much did this by using their resources, by using, their smarts, their creativity to fight Nazis. And what happens before art, what happens before creativity, there's always inspiration. So I really wanted to tell both stories, the one in the past and in the present, from the perspective of inspiration. And the symbol I used for that was the Blackbird, because I thought back of that moment during the hunger winter in Amsterdam, when my mother and my grandmother heard the Blackbird sing. And in that moment, they got so much hope from that moment that I thought the Blackbird is a really powerful symbol for inspiration. I have certainly experienced the effects of inspiration. I've been I felt the power of it. This book is 250 pages, more than 250 pages. It contains 900 drawings and 100 historic photographs. And making it wasn't always easy, especially the research phase when I was searching for the descendants of the people I wrote about, and I had to reach out to them and basically ask them about one of the most difficult times in their lives. And I didn't know these people. So there were definitely times during the research phase, but also during the drawing and the writing phase, that I was overwhelmed, that I thought, perhaps I bit off more than I could chew. But it was always inspiration that pulled me through, because I would think back of those very heroic people and what they did, and that just propelled me forward and made me more determined to commit this to paper and to see it through. So I think inspiration takes many different forms. I certainly believe it plays a huge part in the lives of artists, but I also believe it plays a part in our regular lives. I think when people decide to join the resistance, even if that's at great risk to them, if they decide to put the well-being of another person ahead of their own, then I believe that is also an inspired act. So I've certainly felt the effects of inspiration, and I hope that you do too. And when it presents itself in your life, I hope that you will also choose to do what is right in your heart. And I thank you so much for listening so intently. And if there's any questions, I would be delighted to answer those.
I have a question. I'm curious as to what happened to those children after the war was over.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question is, what happened to the children?
Particularly in regard to their heritage.
Yes, this is such a good question. And this is another reason I really wanted to show the end of the story. Many children, their parents never came back. In fact, the vast majority of their children, their parents never ever returned. Many families raised the children as their own, because during the war, they often did not tell the children that they were not the natural parents, because it was simply too dangerous to do so. They just pretended that they were actual children. And then after the war, when their parents just did not return, you know what, let me take that. Oops, I'm going to swap you. No, it keeps falling off. So it keeps, so I was like, holding my head like this. Sure. So this is a little bit easier.
It's on.
Oh, it is on. Yeah. So I spoke to Jaap, and Jaap was one of those children. Jaap was smuggled out of the childcare center when he was only a year and a half. So he has no memory of it. And he was placed with a foster family. And he was told as he grew older, as he turned 2 and turned 3, that these were his parents, and he called them mom and dad. His parents were both sent to Auschwitz. His father was murdered in Auschwitz, but his mother survived. She came back after the war. And this is trauma upon trauma, because of course she was so relieved to find out, to discover that her son had survived. But her son didn't recognize her. And her son was confused because the people he was calling mom and dad were not, in fact, his mom and dad. And he, of course, moved in with his actual mother. But there is such tremendous trauma in that. But my story, the premise of my story is that grandmother, when she was a young girl, was taken in by a young family, and because her parents did not come back, she was raised as their own and never found out that she was in fact not a biological child until in her 70s. The medical establishment, while doing tests, informed her that she was no biological match. There is tremendous, I mean, in a way, these children who are now in their 80s and some of them are in their 90s, some of them are still alive. They've had lots of trauma. Like my friend Jaap, who I talked to, he says that whenever I step into a room, people begin to talk about the Holocaust. And when they don't talk about it, I do. Because this single thing has defined his entire life and has formed him, has shaped him. So I believe all these children, whether they were taken in by loving families and raised as their own or not, they all have a tremendous amount of trauma.
Oh, you can hear me. I don't really have a question. I just like to make a comment, though. That was an excellent presentation. You did a really great job of looking at all these aspects in Holland, at that dark part of history, and integrating them all together in a very meaningful way. And your passion really shows. So
Thank
I
you
just
so
tell you,
much.
a job well done.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Just real quick, are you willing to share your feelings on what's happening in the world now, in this country now?
Yeah. Well, I recognize things, right? Because I have been studying things so much for so long. And I am a firm believer, I'm a firm believer in the power of art. I already spoke about that a little bit. And that is one that I feel very strongly about, that stories and art and should not be regulated. Books should not be banned. I think every person has a right to not read the books that they don't want to read. Every parent has the right not to let their child read books that they want their children reading. But I don't believe it is right to ban books from, for instance, entire school districts or entire parts of the country, because I think it is very important for everyone to both see themselves in a book, no matter what your lived experience or your heritage or your racial background or your gender identity is. But I also believe it is extremely important that we are all able to read about experiences that are different from ours. I can tell from my own experience that when I read a book about a person who is different from me, who has a different lived experience, it opens my eyes, it opens my world, and it introduces me to an experience that I would not have normally had. So I'm a firm believer that banning any type of expression is not a good thing, and that is something that I see in the world that I'm concerned about. Yes.
This gentleman had a second part of his
Oh, sorry.
question.
Okay.
And his second part of the question is, for those children who were adopted, did any of them learn that they were Jewish, and were they able to embrace their heritage?
Yes. Oh, that's a very good question. So there's not one experience, right? I believe that there's children out there that perhaps never learned their true identity, that they died not knowing. There are certainly children who found out at a later date, and there were also children who did know all along. Of course, those children that were older at the time they were placed with the foster family, who actually had a memory of their biological parents, they would certainly know. The school that I spoke about, was opened. This book, I translated the book into Dutch, and it came out last year in the Netherlands. And only 3 weeks before my book was published, in the school that was the location of this place where so many children were rescued, there's now a Holocaust museum, but it only opened last year, 80 years after the war. So obviously I'm overjoyed that museum is there, but I'm also very sad that it had to take 80 years. I think that is a problem, and it's something that we Dutch people have some soul searching to do about. I think, having studied this, I think there's a lot of trauma that is still unresolved in the Netherlands. I think we're only beginning to talk about these difficult things, there was a small amount of Dutch people that actively resisted the Nazis. There was a small number of Dutch people who actively collaborated, and they often had outsized influence because they were given the plum jobs. So they had huge influence. They were the ones who got to control the media and the banking and all economic and financial and military systems. But the vast majority of Dutch people didn't do anything, right? The vast majority of Dutch people was just trying to get through the war, was just trying to put their head down and how do I put food on the table tonight? I know that all this stuff is happening in the city of Amsterdam. 80,000 Amsterdammers, residents, Jewish Amsterdammers, were deported. At the time, that was 10% of the population. Can you imagine if 10% of Temecula disappeared, just like taken out of schools, taken out of churches, neighbors disappearing? That has a tremendous impact. But yet, the vast majority of Dutch people did not resist. And I believe that if they had resisted much earlier, if they had said much earlier, I am not okay with this, I am not okay with my neighbors being treated that way, then I absolutely believe that the numbers would not have been as grim as they are.
Quite a few of the surviving children, particularly the older ones, wound up in Israel eventually.
Yes. Yeah, they did. Yeah. There was actually an organization that was a big proponent of bringing the survivors to Israel. And this is actually also, I was very fortunate. I had a woman who, her name is Esther Shaya. She was a historian and knew so much about the history of the Dutch theater and the Child Care Center. And she really helped me do research and also write my book and also helped me with some of the more sensitive issues because I'm not Jewish, right? So it's not my experience. She shared with me that has also been painful because children were taken from the one family they knew and brought to Israel. So there is a lot of trauma and pain done to those children and to the survivors. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, you did most of your study primarily in Amsterdam. Did you find the same situation in any other larger cities? Rotterdam or,
Wow, yeah, every city does have its own experience. I studied mostly Amsterdam because I have such a personal tie with it. Rotterdam had its own history because Rotterdam, the entire city center was bombed. That's actually what started the war. What made the Dutch capitulate after 5 days because the Nazis bombed the entire city of Rotterdam. That's why Rotterdam is one of the few cities in the Netherlands that is all new. You do not have the canals and the quaint historic homes that you see in most other Dutch cities. So Rotterdam certainly has its own history. I think what made Amsterdam special is because the vast majority, in total 104,000 Jewish people were deported from the Netherlands and murdered. 80,000 of those came from the city of Amsterdam. So Amsterdam had a very large Jewish population and as a consequence was hit hardest by the Holocaust. And some other cities weren't. But I would say that the things I spoke about in terms of the resistance, in terms of the resistance banking, in terms of the forging, that did happen in most places. Yeah.
They had to survive
they had to survive equally. The cities actually had it hardest because, especially the hunger winter, was grimmest there. People who lived on farms could often like grow their own food, or they'd have eggs, or maybe a sheep, and many people from the cities would ride their bikes to farms to try to barter for food so they could survive. So the countryside had it a little bit better than the cities.
All right. Well, as Mark so eloquently said, very impressive presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Yes, my
And
pleasure. Thank you
once
for having
again,
me.
book is for sale back there. If you want, once again, there's a bookstore in Old Town right behind the bank on Main Street. Your name again? That's In Bloom Bookstore. You can get the book there correctly? All right. And then once again, next month, we have John Hess doing his presentation on the 19th of May, Monday the 19th. And then as you leave tonight, if you didn't sign in, please sign out. All right? Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate that.